Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sacred to Secular podcast. I'm your host, Jack Adams, and I'm joined today with Spencer Hulon. Hi, Spencer.
Hello.
Spencer, we really appreciate you joining the podcast today. So, just as a little bit of a introduction, Spencer was born and raised in Orem, Utah, as a Mormon. We're going to talk a little bit about that today, his journey in Mormonism and his journey out of Mormonism. And really, he's just kind of your normal, everyday, average ex-Mormon. He works in IT and still lives in Utah. Is there anything that I'm missing there, Spencer?
Yeah. Yep. I don't think there's a whole lot about my story that most ex-Mormons wouldn't be able to relate to. But I think you mentioned something when I spoke with you earlier that, you can't ever have too many people telling their story. And I think there's parts of my story that might be unique, but I'm looking forward to kind of jumping in and telling about kind of what makes my story unique and things I kind of gathered along the way.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that. I know that there are some parts of your story that are definitely unique. So we're looking forward to talking about that. Is there anything that you want to share before we get started as far as intentions for coming out of the podcast?
Yeah, I've tried to give this some thought. Ever since I left the church, I didn't do a big social media. Hey guys, here's all the reasons why I didn't do a letter. I had personal conversations with the most important people in my life, and that was that. Um, I think the reason why I want to do this is so my story will be in the ethos of the internet, and that hopefully, if there's anybody who can relate to any part of my story, that they can kind of pull from it and hopefully gather strength from it. I also want this to be kind of a formalized way for me to tell my story that I could pass on to my kids. My kids are one of the most important aspects of my life, and I think something like this would be really cool for them to look at and see.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Um, it is really healing. One, for you to be able to share your own story, but then two, for other people to be able to hear that story and relate to it. So, again, thank you for being willing to come on. All right, great. Well, let's just start from the beginning then. If you could walk us through your childhood, specifically through the lens of Mormonism, how did it affect you as a child, and maybe some specific stories that you wanted to share?
Um, I think going back, I think we'll look at my parents first. So on my mom's side, it goes back to the pioneers. My one of my ancestors is Levi Ward Hancock, who is closely associated with Joseph Smith. He was a bodyguard, I believe, very involved in the early days and founding of the church. My dad is or was a convert to the church, brought in by missionaries. They got married and brought myself, uh, three brothers and one sister into the world. And a lot of my Mormon upbringing, I would consider to be pretty pretty standard. I know, like, when you hear stories from people talk about Mormonism, there's a lot that's you could pretty much copy paste everything about your typical Mormon upbringing. I was born in San Diego, um, and eventually, about age 6 or 8, we moved to Utah. And a lot of our upbringing was very strict. We weren't allowed to watch um, Simpsons. We weren't allowed to watch anything PG-13. Um, it was a very, I would consider it a very control-oriented upbringing. Um, we had family home evening on the reg. We read scriptures every morning, and standards and rules were expected to be kept, and standards were very high in my family growing up.
You mentioned there were four siblings. What order were you in? Were you the oldest, the youngest?
Yeah, I had one older sister, and she came from I guess she is technically a half sister. I never knew her father or anything. He was out of the picture long before I came in. Um, and then after me, I have three younger brothers. So I am the oldest boy in my family.
Yeah, so it sounds like your family was pretty strict. How did that manifest itself? So you mentioned not being able to watch like PG-13 movies, not being able to watch The Simpsons. Were there any other rules that were part of your growing up?
So this might be going into maybe more depth, um, but our emotions were regulated. Like we were taught from a young age that there are only certain emotions that are to be accepted. Um, Disagreements, arguing were super taboo for siblings. Um, we uh, we were expected to put on a happy face when we went to church, and a lot of, if I had to describe something about our upbringing, it was to show the our community that we were one of them. And the way we did that was by putting on a happy face and doing all the things. Um, and I think that brought a pressure to kind of, how do I explain it? To kind of live up to people's expectations. And I think from a young age, um, I had a belief, and I'm still wrestling with it to this day, is you are not good enough, and so you must show that you are good enough. And that manifested itself in some wild ways. Um, Trying to think if there's like anything else that's super specific to my family. Yeah, arguing was taboo. Um, at least among siblings. My parents argued a lot, but so that created some cognitive dissonance. One other thing that I guess is not ideal about my childhood is my father was super abusive on the emotional and sometimes on the physical side. And I think it created a crazy cognitive dissonance where I would have these Sundays where we'd go in and my dad would bear the most beautiful testimony you've ever seen in your life, telling how he loves all his kids and how he's grateful for all of us. And then we'd come home and he would scream at us all day. To this day, I still have a hard time. I'm a lot better, but I have a hard time on Sundays because I was just so trained to be on edge on Sunday. And I think that that played a part in my story as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like there's this side of you that you project out to the world, and then there's the side of you that you have to kind of put on a happy face for church, and that's manifesting your dad. It seems like you have to do that to some degree. So, would you say that your home life was not a safe space for you then?
No, I do have good memories as a childhood, but so many of those good memories are overshadowed with this feeling of unease. You felt like you had to always be on your guard, and um, I felt like I had to almost be a caricature of myself or what a good son is, and I think that was really stressful. With that said, one part of Mormonism that was really beautiful for me during that time is connecting with a really good set of friends that I have to this day. I'm 37 now. I've had the same friends since I was 11. And that was more or less where I felt like I could be myself. We had tons of awesome memories going camping, backpacking, scouting trips were amazing for us. They probably weren't too amazing for the women in our group. I'm pretty sure the way things worked back then is that the young men would get the lion's hoard of money for activities, but for us, it was fantastic. It was really good.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up question. So, if your home wasn't a safe space for you, did church become that safe space for you? And it sounds like, you had some really great leaders. They took you camping, you had all these planned activities. Mormonism, just like so many things in life, is rarely all good or all bad.
Yeah, and I think this will play a part in the narrative moving forward. But one big thing I've done to kind of get myself into a healthier space is to be able to go back to my childhood and be able to identify the good parts. So much, I think, in with a lot of people in the ex-Mormon community, it's just easier to paint things black and white. Mormon, all things bad, and everything else is good. But one thing that's helped me is being able to identify some of the good parts of my upbringing that were healthy and helped me and sustained me to this day.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful healing exercise, going back into your past and finding those things that are still meaningful and valuable to you from your upbringing. For so many people, having a faith crisis is a really unmooring experience. But being able to still connect to your past self and reconnect with those parts that are still as much a part of you as anything else uh, can be really healing and really powerful. That's not the move for everyone. Some people need to completely, move beyond Mormonism and not try to dig through it and find meaning in it. But it sounds like going back and reclaiming some of those pieces of your past was the move for you.
And I guess everybody's going to heal in a different way, and we will eventually get to my transition out of the church. But yeah, being able to identify the good parts of my upbringing have been huge. Um, my group of friends were pretty competitive. Um, I was involved in sports all growing up. I did wrestling, I did martial arts. I got really into weightlifting. And looking back, I can kind of see how those outlets were good. But in another way, some of those outlets came from deep-seated feelings of not feeling good enough. And so it was almost like a way for me to kind of take back my power. Um, I'm if I could lift X amount of weight, then maybe that means I'm good enough. If I could work really hard on this thing that I'm good at, then maybe I'll be good enough. And that was kind of a reoccurring theme. And that's something that carried into that competitiveness, that not feeling good enough, carried into my mission. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious, is your dad still in the picture at this point, or did your parents get divorced at any point?
Yeah, so that was pretty traumatic. So they ended up getting divorced while I was on my mission. I have not talked to my dad for probably 8 or 9 years, which sucks. I would much prefer to have a nice, functional father that could be there in my life and could, you know, be the father that you see in movies or the fathers that I see in my friends' lives. Like there's so much, there's so many positives to that. But the way things went down with my dad, I would consider him to be a absolute textbook narcissist. A lot of his motivations for doing things for us were actually for him. And it made it difficult to really trust when he was really sorry about something. Um, a lot he would use the whole "I have the priesthood, you need to listen to me" strong arm thing. Um, and constantly throughout my childhood, there was a pattern that would occur. He would have some form of outburst or abuse, and then he would give you the most heartfelt apology you've ever heard in your life. And you would believe it. I would believe it. And that same Sunday, if it was fast and testimony meeting, he would give the most beautiful uh, outpouring of love to his family and the gospel. And then it would happen again. And so a lot of my upbringing was highs, ups, and downs. I think my mom really struggled to kind of keep the family together. Um, I don't know how the church is sitting now, but back in those days, like if a husband was abusive, there's not a whole lot the church would do. They preferred to take kind of a back seat in that regard. And I suppose it's so they wouldn't have to deal with liability. But it felt like very early on that there's no one looking out for us and we're kind of on our own and we just have to survive. And yeah, so because of a massive long story of like ups and downs with my father and I guess what it can kind of center down to is a refusal to acknowledge harm done. I am one of those people that have elected to not keep their parent in their lives because of just refusal to acknowledge harm done. Um, so yeah, I haven't talked with them in years. I have a really close relationship with my mom. My mom wasn't perfect growing up, but the big difference between my dad and my mom is that when my mom said she was sorry, or she raised her voice or lost her temper when she said sorry, it actually meant something. And so because of that, I have this beautiful relationship with my mother. We get along fantastic.
Yeah, that's great. You had mentioned so you have this really good group of friends. Was there any sort of fronts being put up there as well? Like, could you really be yourself around them, or did you feel like you had to try to pretend to be someone else around them as well?
There was a competitive element to our friendship, I think, but it wasn't like outward. It was mostly internal. Like I felt like I could be myself while I was around them, but at the same time, I felt this need like I got to keep up with them. I don't want to be the odd one out. So when everybody's going on missions, for me, it was not even a question if I should go on a mission. It was absolutely, I'm going on a mission because I'll be damned if I'm the only one in our friend group who doesn't go on a mission. So yeah, it was competitive, but I wouldn't consider it like I I felt like I had to put on a mask when I was at home. And when I was around them, I felt like I could really be myself. We can talk about things. But being raised in Mormonism, I still feel like there's this element of like we all gotta, we might be a little wild and rambunctious, but when it comes to spiritual things, we're gonna fall in line and we're gonna do what the church says. So there was that there as well. And to be honest with you, all growing up, I don't think I ever had a point where I questioned um, throughout my childhood or in my teens, not even on my mission did I really question. It was, this is what the right thing to do is, and I'm going to do it no matter what. Um, One other thing that's kind of interesting is coming up to the time where I went on my mission, um, that's when my dad left my family, emptied the bank accounts, pieced out of nowhere, left a note, said, "Bye, guys, I'm gone." And this was like
Wow.
probably a few months before I went on my mission, which was massively stressful. Up to around that time, he started upping abuse, not with me so much. Like there's this interesting thing that started happening the older I got. Like I said, I started getting into weightlifting and wrestling. I was considerably stronger than my dad. And my dad, being an abuser, wouldn't target people who could stand up to him. So we started doing this thing where he would pick on my family. I would go on a California trip with my friends, and that's when things really got really bad for my family. Um, he would never push things with me. Um, so I was, for that last part, I was kind of immune to some of it. But yeah, I find out like after I get back from California, hey, your dad's gone. Um, and I was real that was like the first time I actually questioned if I should go on a mission because I was dealt with this scenario where I don't know what's gonna happen. I have no idea if my family's gonna be okay. Being that my dad has these highs and lows, he's capable, in my mind, he was capable of literally anything. And I didn't know how that would affect my family. So I'm going into bishop's interviews and um, stake president interviews, and I'm asking like from the bottom of my heart, like, should this be something I do? Because there's a lot that's unstable. I feel like if I leave, my family won't be protected. Because, like I said, my dad would do things with my family that he wouldn't do if I was there. And I got the same type of messaging, and that was if you go on a mission, your family will be protected. And to add on top of that, to just dig in the knife of pressure, they told me if you don't go on a mission, the chances of your brothers going on missions, your younger siblings, is going to be gone. Like they're not going to go. And growing up, you hear a whole bunch of narratives about people who don't go on missions or don't do all the church things they're supposed to do, or even worse, people who leave the church and what their lives turn into. And they built in a lot of fear, like, hey, if you don't do this, then you're screwing your family essentially. And so I feel like my decision to go on a mission was very much so under duress.
Yeah, it feels very coerced. And at 19, you're essentially being asked by the leaders of your local church to shoulder the spiritual responsibility of your family and be almost the father to your siblings. Is that what it felt like?
It most certainly did. I felt like I had to be the one to do all the things, and it fell onto my shoulders. Going back, something I've done through therapy is going back to my younger self and be like, "Hey, that wasn't on you, dude. You should have just been able to be a young adult and grow and explore in whatever way that you wanted. That was not your responsibility." But I did. I put all of it on my shoulders, and um, that was a big motivating factor for getting me out. And that motivating factor actually made it so, this is going to sound so weird to say, because I know some people who go on missions and they have the most horrific, traumatizing experience of their life, especially for the poor people that go out and they don't know why they're there. They were told, like, if you don't go on a mission, we're not going to pay for your school. That wasn't me. My reason for going was to save my family. So with that motivation in mind, I was going to be a hardworking missionary no matter what, because I felt like my efforts would directly translate to the protection of my family, um, which sucks as well to have that much pressure on myself during then.
Sure. And then, not to add even more pressure to what you're already feeling at this point in time, but did you even feel worthy to go on a mission? Or was that another factor in kind of turning up the screws on the pressure of the situation?
Oh, this adds another element. So, like most young Mormon boys, masturbation, pornography are major taboos. I'm a part of the generation that was told that sexual sin is next to murder. Killing someone, masturbation, in my mind at that time, were side by side. Exactly. That's kind of how I saw it. That's what my dad told me, which is ironic because my dad had an actual porn problem. I'm careful when talking about porn problems because I think sometimes porn addiction is largely conflated into something that is not actually a problem, and it kind of makes a mountain out of a molehill. My dad did have a problem. He was looking at pornography on the job. And that's how you know something is a problem, is you can't stop doing it. Like, it's disrupting your normal everyday life.
Yeah, you like they can't hold down a job. They're a danger to society. For example, I've heard people that, can't even drive their car without looking at their phone to consume it. So I definitely agree with that sentiment.
For sure. The problem with this, so my mom is dealing with this, right? A husband who can't keep a job because he can't stop looking at porn on the job. And she's terrified her kids are going to turn into that. And so the added level of sexual shame was just through the roof in our home. Um, I know now that masturbation for a young teenager is something that's totally normal. And in fact, if I wasn't doing that, there would probably be some things that a therapist might have to look into. Um, but it was something that was very much taboo in my family. And it's something that whenever we talked about sex or things of that nature, it was always with a heavy dose of shame. So I'm getting this at home, and you'd go into church, and I'm getting the same exact messaging from my priesthood leaders. And I I literally thought I was the only person in the world that was doing it. And I'm not exaggerating. It sounds insane because Surely everybody has done, especially young men, have done this. It's a normal part of growing up. But in my mind, because of how things were, I thought that I was the worst person in the world. And this also contributes to this life narrative I've been expressing, which is I never felt good enough. And so I would go through these ups and downs where, like, the harder I tried to fight against it, the harder it was to avoid it and the more prevalent on my brain it was. And I was just constantly wrestling back and forth with, am I good enough? And my worth was literally like, do you masturbate or not? I think I had some, like when I was really young, like nine or so, I I remember going to therapy for like behavioral issues. I have ADHD. And when you're a young boy, that manifests itself in ways that are disruptive to a traditional neurotypical classroom. So I would go to therapy to get ADHD looked at. And the doctor would, or the psychologist would be like, do you know why you're here? And I'd be like, it's because I masturbate. And that's what I thought. I thought like I'm here because I'm caught. I'm a horrible person. I thought I was going to be looked at like a psychopath in my mind. And
And this is at 9 years old. Wow.
keep in mind at nine, like anybody who has kids that grow up, they're going to start exploring with themselves. And so this wasn't like I'm addicted to masturbating 9-year old. I was just, it was a very normal self exploratory type deal. It's something that wasn't even on the psychiatrist's mind at all. Like he could care less about that. But I'm just trying to paint a picture with how prevalent this was from such a young age and
Yeah,
kind
and
of how
for
I thought about it.
yeah, and I think I said wow, not because you were doing that at 9 years old, but more because that's a startling level of shame for a 9 year old to be dealing with. Like anytime something was outside of the norm, or you thought you were in trouble for something, that's immediately where your mind went. And again, that's just like a really startling level of shame for a 9 year old to be carrying.
Yeah. And it seemed like that aspect of my life did not let off. There were moments where I was quote unquote clean, and then I would fail, and then it would be rinse, repeat, shame cycle over and over and over and over again. And so I brought up like the athletics, the lifting. These are all things I did to help make me feel like I had some control of my life because that part felt like I could never win at. So I'm gonna at least be able to bench 225. Good for me. At the time, that felt validating. Um, and that continued up to like with my bishops. I had a bishop that I perceived as being very, I think he was raised in a very sheltered life. I don't think he was able to relate to me or the other boys in our priest group at all. um, when I was working really hard to go on a mission, and keep in mind, like all this tumultuous stuff is happening in my family. He knows I want to go on a mission and I want to be honest. So it's coming close to the time of my mission. And he asked me, have you masturbated? And I say, I did have a moment of weakness. It was really stressful at home and I just wanted things to turn off. And I told him, yeah, I masturbated, but I haven't done it again in weeks. And he's like, thank you for telling me. I'm going to have you wait 6 months. So I don't know. At the time, that was one of the worst things to ever happen because I'm one of the younger ones in my friend group. All my friends are out on missions. I'm struggling to keep it together. And because I was honest and admitted to that, I was postponed 6 months. And so again, it's adding to this narrative of like, you're not good enough. Look at you. You couldn't even go on a mission. You couldn't even not masturbate for this. So I don't know. It was just so overwhelming at the time.
Yeah, so not only do you have the pressure of quote unquote needing to save your family by going on a mission, but then you're a little bit honest with the bishop and your mission is delayed. So you have that added pressure on top of that. So, I mean, putting myself in your shoes, I'm thinking, man, I'm the worst person ever right now. And you're what, 19, 20 at this point?
I was 19.
Okay.
Yeah, I was 19. So I left on my mission when I was about 19 and a half. And I, what I told myself was like, all right, you're a piece of crap, but you're a hard worker. And so when I go on this mission, this isn't about me anymore. This isn't about like going on a mission for me. This is, I'm going to go on a mission and I'm going to work hard. I already know I'm probably going to hell because this is something I'm never going to be able to shake. But I'm going to do this for my family. And I almost had this like self-sacrificing mentality as a young 19-year-old that I'm going to go do this and I'm going to work 3 times as hard as anybody else. And it's essentially because I was trying to, I guess, work my way into God's graces and because I wanted to have my family protected while I was out. So, going on, kind of transitioning into the mission era, I actually loved my mission. Um, I think as far as my Mormon journey goes, that was probably the best I've ever done. I felt for the most part like I was doing the right thing. Um, and this is kind of a hard thing to admit as well, but I've done a lot of work to kind of get here. But a big part of why I think I did so well and maybe why others don't do as well is because for me, the mission was so much better than my home life and the stress that was happening. I could almost bypass like all the trauma that happened. And I just had to tell myself, hey, I'm doing the right thing. All my leaders are telling me I'm doing the right thing. And I could just double down and focus on my missionary work. And because I have ADHD, having a very structured environment was actually fantastic for my brain. It did really well under having a specific schedule. I knew my purpose. Everything was black and white. And I feel like I thrived on my mission. I did really, really well and have a lot of awesome memories. I have good friends that I have kept up to this day from my mission. And I had a good mission president too. At least as far as my experiences with him, I felt like he was my advocate. There was a point in my mission where my dad was really angry at me because some of my journal was used with my permission in a court case to kind of show his level of abuse. Because at the time, my dad wasn't just wanting a divorce, he wanted full custody. He wanted to make it so my mom would never see us again. And keep in mind, my mom is the one that is actually a good person who has overcome her shortcomings and has shown up for us consistently. Whereas my dad was vindictive and hateful. And so at some point on my mission, he tried to get a hold of my mission president and told him that I shouldn't be out because he doesn't, he was falling back on that temple question that says that, what is the question? Is there anything in your life that is not in harmony with your parents or what? I forget how it goes. Like, is there anyone in your family that you've wrong? I forget what the exact wording is,
Yeah, it's along those lines. I'd have to look it up though.
but he was using that like, hey, my son doesn't have a good relationship with me. You need to send him home. That was it. And luckily, my mission president had my back. It was like, no, he's here because he wants to be, and you're not allowed to contact him if he doesn't want you to contact him. And so many times throughout my like upbringing, I felt like a lot of church leadership didn't really advocate for me or my family. There was always this blind eye that was turned where my dad would do horrible things. It would end up in the bishop's office, and the bishop's guidance would be, you need to be more patient with him. He's doing the best he can. And I felt like we didn't have a whole lot of people growing up that were advocates for us. So it was nice to have a mission president that was able to advocate for me, at least in that way.
Do you feel like your mission president was somewhat of a father figure in your life then at that point?
Big time in that sense. I felt like he had my best interest, and I felt like he had my back. And that's something I hadn't felt from many male figures in my life. So it was good in that regard.
So you went out and you did the whole 2 years in Orlando, or did you go home early?
I I mean, the only time where it really I felt like I'm all right, I'm getting bored of this was probably like my last 6 months. I was starting to really miss home, and I was like, okay, I want to be back. There was also a lot of horrible things that happened while I was on my mission. And in one sense, I was like, I'm glad I don't have to deal with it selfishly. The other part of me was like, I need to be there to see my family. So while I was gone, my dad made certain that the house was lost and my family didn't have anywhere to go. Being my mom coming from a traditional household herself, women were not allowed to work in the Mormon church. So my mom gave her life to raise us. And um, as a result, she had a really hard time finding employment after the divorce. She had a hard time finding lawyers who could help. She spent countless hours working at different lawyer offices, cleaning to help pay lawyer bills late in the night. And so they lost the house, and my family ended up in government housing, like government assisted housing. And there were bishops that luckily, not my home bishop, don't care for him too much, but there were other bishops in the government housing area that I think were helpful to my mom, at least in some ways. And we run into this unique situation where I'm wanting to come home, but I'm also scared because the way that government housing is set up, they are allotted X amount of people that can stay in the house. And if you break those rules, you lose government housing. Yeah, I had nowhere to be when I got home. So it was awesome to be home and to see my family again. But I could tell looking at it, they were tired. They looked like they'd been through hell and back. And I listened to their stories and they really did go through hell and back. Um, but yeah, I was allowed to stay, I think 1, maybe 2 weeks there. Um, and I had to figure things out really quick. And luckily, because I did have a network of really solid dudes I hung out with, one of my friends offered for me to stay in his grandpa's basement apartment that he was living in at the time. And I was able to live with him for a while and kind of get on my feet. He was patient with me finding a job, and eventually I found a job and slowly was able to get into a place where I could start paying rent. But I had to grow up in ways that I was not fully ready for. And things just didn't land in an easy way for me when I first got back from my mission.
So is this the period you meet your wife, or is that later on?
Plus two, my so for a lot of people, going to school is the obvious next step. I didn't really have resources to help get me into school. I was living in like the Provo area, but school felt incredibly risky for me. Um, I didn't really know at the time how to access like government assisted grants or anything like that. I was making $7 an hour at a car wash job I had in Provo. I just didn't feel like I had the ability to go to school and be successful. Um, so a lot of like I'd say for probably the first 4 years of being back was mostly just survival. There was a lot of good memories too, but I learned at a young age to be good with money because it could all be gone tomorrow. And I wanted to really maintain this like sense of safety. Like I was very reluctant to do risky things. And in my mind, going to college at that time was a risky thing. I eventually did go to college, and that it didn't end up panning out. I started experiencing traumatic symptoms from, I think, what I would suspect is stuff from my childhood. It just made me kind of unstable. And it was really hard for me to cope with keeping up with classes, working and paying my bills and balancing myself emotionally. It just felt a lot. But a couple years, I'd say probably about 5 years after being back from my mission, or maybe 4 years, I can't remember the exact timeline. I did meet my wife, and we met at the Branbury. apartment complex in
Yeah,
Provo. And it has a mixture of BYU students and UVU students. And I'd say like probably 90% of the people are church attending young students. But this particular housing didn't require you to go to school. I think you could put that if you're attending institute, that makes you eligible to live here. So that's what I did. And so a lot of my early 20s were spent living in BYU student housing. And yeah,
Was there any sort of cognitive dissonance forming at this part of your story because you had gone on your mission and you were still watching your family suffer, so it didn't really seem like they had reaped the blessings that you were promised?
it did. I think one thing I got really good at though was pushing things down. And I think the mission taught me how to do that, if I'm being honest. Um, I didn't really deal with a lot in that regard. I would have moments where it would come out. But for the most part, a lot of it was kind of just shoved down. And I was just focusing on survival, paying my bills for the next month, um, while simultaneously keeping myself spiritually pure so I could be good enough to be married someday. Because at the time, that was like my big focus was getting married in the temple, because that's just the next thing you do.
So, I don't know if at this point you want to start talking about your sister a little bit.
So we'd been married for about a year. Um, at this point where I'm going to get at in the story. So for context, I had an older sister. She was a year older than me, or sorry, not a year. She was 10 years older than me. And um, she had kind of she's what I would call the black sheep of the family. She didn't like conforming, um, playing by all the rules. And at least from my young perspective, it felt like she was a bit more rebellious than you would normally see. Um, I think a big reason for that as well is being that she was the oldest. She saw a lot of abuse from my dad. And I think in some way she was trying to run away from it. And so there was points in my life where she was kind of off to, I think she was out of the house by the time she was 16. But we still always maintained a really close, loving relationship. Me being the next sibling down, um, I always felt like a really strong connection to my sister. I almost felt like I had to look out for her. And because I felt like at different points she looked out for me in different parts of our abusive upbringing. And so I always felt really close to her. Um, at some point, she had got into an accident, um, that had her on pain pills. And those pain pills, I think, were the start of her demise. She was always a little bit outside of the Mormon norm, but she was a good person and she would work hard to help other people around her. And she was a good mom. She wasn't raising her kids specifically in the church, but she was a good mom. And what ended up happening tragically is, I think, at least as far as how I'm able to deal with it, it seems like she got more addicted to these pain pills. And I think it made it so she wasn't able to function at a high level. And eventually, what happened was, when she couldn't get pain pills anymore, she started going to harder drugs. And um, this had a result on with her and housing. I think I don't know. I can't recall all the details, but essentially she was kicked out of her housing, and she eventually found herself in a home that would take in, I guess, stragglers. At the time, she had two kids, but I think this home she found herself in wasn't a church sanctioned home, but there was another church in the Provo area that had someone there that would take in like homeless people. Um, and keep in mind during this time, like my mom is in, I think she's living with her sister at this time, and the sister has a full house of kids. I'm living in an apartment. Um, and my sister's habits at the time were turning more destructive. Like anybody who's been around folks who have drug problems, drugs turn you into a different person. And it got to a point where I I wouldn't feel comfortable letting my sister in our home at the time, just because of how destructive she was becoming. Um, and hindsight's 2020. I think at the time I'm operating from a place of like, I gotta be as Mormon as I possibly can. And I didn't really understand drugs at the time. I didn't really understand what they do. All I saw was my sister's making really, really bad decisions. Um, she wasn't getting her kids to school. And at some point, the kids were eventually removed from the home and placed into foster care. And this was a catalyst point in my wife's life, in my life, where we had been married for about a year and we get a call from the state saying, "Hey, we have your sister's kids and they're safe. They're in a temporary foster home, but we'd like to put them in a more long-term foster home." And at the time, I kind of saw the writing on the wall. I felt like this is a possibility. And I remember even talking to my friends and saying, like, this is something I think could happen where the kids will be taken away. And early on, I told myself, if that ever happens, I want to be able to step up and help support them. Um, so that's exactly what happened. We I remember sitting in a room with the caseworker, and it was like my younger siblings, myself and my wife. We had just bought our first home that was larger than what we needed. It didn't have AC, but it was at least a big house. It was our first home. And at the time, I felt really strongly, and my wife felt really strongly that we want to be the ones to step up and raise the kids. Or at the time in our minds, it was we want to foster them and provide them a safe space. Um, they were about, I think, if I remember the ages right, like 6 and 11 or 6 and 10, like young. And my wife and I were on the younger side as well. I think I was 25. My wife, I think, was 20 or really young. Like I think she might have been getting close to 20. I don't remember the exact ages of everybody, but yeah, we were on the younger side. So we agreed to let them in and treat them as the family they are. And our plan is like, and the caseworker warned us of this. He's like, just so you know, you are not going to be able to, you basically have to pick what side of the camp you want to be on. Either you can advocate for the kids or you can advocate for your sister. You cannot do both. The state will not allow you to do that because the state needs to know that you are putting the kids' interests first. And if they perceive a conflict of interest, then you won't be able to have the kids anymore. So
Yeah, it's crazy. I've never thought about it in those terms before. That essentially you would have to, is turn against your sister the right phrasing there?
that's what it felt like at the time. And I felt like I had to pick a camp, either help the kids or help my sister. Um, because the last thing that we wanted was for the kids to be taken from our house if there was like some conflict of interest. Um, so we were going off a lot of what the caseworker was saying. They tried to like paint what it would look like if I were to like help my sister. And basically all I could really do was be a supportive role. Like, hey, all the things that the state is asking you to do, please do it. But what I think a deeper reason why you're saying you're going to have to pick sides is you're in between her kids and there's not really many people in the world that could look at someone who's in between your kids and have a good relationship with them still. And I remember thinking like, oh no, my sister has my back. I love my sister. Like I'm sure she'll see that, I have to follow these rules. And I'm certain she won't hate me for this. And sure enough, as time went on, my sister, like there was just tension. And our relationship slowly started to derail. And I remember at the time, I felt almost crippled by the whole situation, where I felt like I'm watching my sister's life slowly devolve. And she wasn't, the hardest thing about that situation is that she wasn't um, doing the things that the court had asked her. She was hardly showing up for even visitations, which I can't even begin to describe how hard it is to explain to children that to explain why their mom didn't show up to see them for the small amount of time that they could. And that reason is because she was high. Oh, it was an impossible situation. And admittedly, I started to build resentment as time went on. I'm like, how could you not show up for your kids? Like, we want this to happen. And what it started looking like is that we would have to it started looking like we would get full custody because she just was not doing anything to win him back. And one day I'm at work and I get a call from my mom in a panic, crying violently, saying that April Dawn, my sister, had died. And at that point in my life, everything stopped. Um, I started going into a panic myself. I told my managers that like I told them what happened. They hugged me and let me go. And honestly, a lot of that day kind of fuzzes away. Like you almost disassociate when something traumatic like that happens. But we found out that she had died of a drug overdose. And what the coroner said, what their assessment was that she had taken a ton of painkillers and or what was it? I think she had taken a lot of, I think, meth and then took a lot of painkillers, and the painkillers are what ended up killing her. Um, and my whole worldview flipped upside down from that point, spiritually, and how I saw myself in the universe. Everything was different.
Yeah, when we had originally talked, you had mentioned that you and your wife felt like if you went to church, did all the things you were supposed to, essentially ticked all the boxes, that you were going to be blessed by having your sister be able to figure all this out, take the kids back, right? So again, this pressure that you need to be the one to take care of your family spiritually. Well, it seems like at this point that really gets flipped on its head.
Yes. So yeah, to go into that, I totally had the belief that like, hey man, if I do all the right things, if I follow the commandments and get married in the temple, go on a mission, that God would look after my family. Like, and to go back to this is the messaging I heard from leadership growing up with me going on a mission during that tumultuous time. And I think at the time I told myself, like, oh man, there really were miracles. Like when my mom and my family were didn't have a home anymore, a miracle happened where they were shot up on the list and they were able to get into government housing. There was legitimately good people in our lives who looked out for my family during then. I don't want to give like the church too much credit to be honest. But there were good individuals who were looking out, like giving my mom money, giving food out of their own pocket. And so I I felt like, even though sometimes some things can get hard, they'll never get to a point where you can't handle it. There's that scripture I'm reminded of: God will never test you with more than you can handle, butchering the exact wording of it, but that's more or less the message. So I knew things could get hard, but God would still take care of us. So after my sister died, that was something I felt like I could not handle and I could not comprehend at all, because in our minds, like what would have been ideal? You read in the scriptures about all these stories about God softening people's hearts. The story of Moses, and God, um, softening the heart of Pharaoh, or stories in the early Book of Mormon, and all these things of like God can clearly, He has the power to soften people's hearts. And I spent so many nights praying for hours that God would help my sister. My goal wasn't even for my sister to be Mormon. My goal was just for have God help my sister with this drug addiction, um, and to help her work through that. Like I wasn't even asking for a lot. I felt in my mind. And so when in my mind at the time, it felt like God had taken my sister, and we were having to pick up the pieces, which in the moment, I wish I could go back then and be like, hey, it's going to be okay. You'll figure it out, you know. But at the time, it completely upended my worldview. And things got really hard.
And so you're 25 years old at this point, and it's looking like you're going to be an actual parent to an 11-year-old and a 6-year-old.
Yeah, yeah, it was wild having to jump into that. Like all my friends, my peers were having infants, right?
You have a preteen.
And we're having to do steps that they hadn't gone through themselves. So it's not like we could ask anybody for advice. We just had to kind of figure it out as we went. Um, and we did the very best we could. When we were during the time before we got full custody, which by the way, we didn't get full custody until after my sister had passed. We were in the foster program, and they gave us the option to take additional classes on parenting and family dynamics, which we signed up for. We felt like, you know, we don't know what we're doing. Let's learn how to be better parents. And we learned really good skills for dealing with teens, even though they weren't teenagers yet. We learned really good parenting skills for teens. And we learned a lot of really good best practices in those classes. Um, as something that I think a lot of parents fall into a trap, at least, is they think because I'm a parent, I now automatically know everything. And luckily we were able to kind of navigate that a bit better and be like, we don't know jack crap. So we're going to just do our best to figure it out. Um, so yeah, it was interesting, right? Because you have my wife and I who were very active LDS, and then my our adopted children. And from moving forward from this point on, since we have that context, I'm going to refer to them as my children because that's how we look at them. Kids, they're our everything, and we love them a lot. But yeah, so yeah, they weren't raised strict Mormon like us. They were raised very differently than us. And I became like hyper aware as we're having him go to Sunday school and go through the meetings, that a lot of this, I started being sensitive to what I was just trying to put my feet in their shoes. Like this is all probably a lot. And they had, I felt like in some of the words we were in, some of the words treated them a little bit different. Some of the words treated them really well. But the first ward we were in, I felt like the ward just, I felt like it wasn't a safe space for them. Like something common that happened on and off. There's good examples of good people in the church, and there's bad examples of people in the church. Something that would happen is some of their friends who are in the church might be making mistakes, you know, and what would happen a lot of the time is our kids were being scapegoated, the word, like whatever mistakes these other kids were making would be put on my kids, which is common. in the church. Like there's a thing in Utah where it was worse when I was growing up. It's to be honest, it's a ton better now, but I'm not going to let my kids play with non-member kids because I don't want my kids to be affected. I don't want the devil to get in, or there's that kind of language. There was some of that when my kids were younger, and I just started becoming, my wife and I both started becoming really aware that the church didn't feel like it might have been safe for us in a lot of ways, but it didn't feel safe for them. Um, and we're coming up to another pivotal point in my faith transition. So my youngest is coming up to 8 years old, and my oldest is coming up to 12 years old.
Explain why those are important ages in Mormonism.
Is when you're supposed to be baptized. The LDS Church believes that the age of accountability, for whatever reason that isn't backed by science, is 8 years old, meaning that they can choose between right and wrong. And I guess that equates to them being able to consent to a lifelong commitment. I have opinions on baptism. So I felt a little uneasy about, the 8-year-old coming into baptism age. And I started becoming uneasy with my 12-year-old. 12 is the age that you receive the priesthood. In the LDS Church, there's the Aaronic priesthood, which you get at 12, and then the Melchizedek priesthood, which you get at 16 or 18, can't remember.
18.
Um, And I started being aware because of both of these situations, both of them about to hit these milestones. I became very aware of something else that has to happen before you're able to achieve those milestones. And that is you're supposed to have a bishop's interview. And all of a sudden, I am flooded with all the memories um, of me talking to bishops and having these bishops ask wildly inappropriate questions to young kids, particularly asking young children about what their sexual habits are around masturbation. Um, and I guess the Papa Bear came out in me for a little bit. I started experiencing severe cognitive dissonance where I'm like, this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to talk to the bishop about these things. But also, I'm grappling with the self hatred I had and also dealing with how inappropriate, in hindsight, that it is for an adult to ask a young child sexual questions. In any other school of thought or thinking, that is grooming. If you're an adult asking a young kid about sexual things and they're not a trained therapist, that is grooming. And so I'm dealing with this. And that's where I think another big part of my faith started to crack. So you had the death of my sister, which completely unended my view about God and his involvement in our lives. And then having my kids approach the situation where they're going to talk to men who don't have their best interest. I mean, they might think they do, but they don't know them, asking them evasive questions. Um, at the time, I did everything I could to push things down. Those feelings, I'm like, those are at the time I thought very black and white. I'm like, church good, not church is bad. And so I got to just push that down because that's probably the devil because it's such a pivotal time in their lives. Like clearly this is definitely the devil telling me that, they shouldn't go through these steps. So if they were baptized, the youngest one was baptized and the oldest one received the Aaronic priesthood. But I remember like when the missionaries came over because he was 9 when he was baptized. And once you pass 8, um, you're no longer a child of record baptism. You're technically an investigator. It's every missionary's dream, by the way, to have these types of kids because they're just freebies. You get to like chuck the numbers up that like, it's a convert baptism, even though they're 9. The family just delayed it a little bit. So the missionaries were stoked, but I'm hearing these lessons that I had taught for years. And I'm looking at it from like a critical point of view. And I'm like, why am I thinking about this critically? I don't wasn't expecting that. But I just remember the whole missionary process with my youngest felt uncomfortable to me. The baptism felt uncomfortable to me, and it didn't feel good. So, despite my efforts of trying to bury everything down, I I find out about an individual in the Mormon space named Sam Young. Do you know about Sam Young?
Yeah, definitely. But for the audience, could you please explain who that is?
So, little context: Sam Young is infamous in Mormon spaces. His whole deal was advocating for positive change in the LDS Church to get rid of these more sexual elements in children interviews. He also advocated for adults being in the same room that these interviews are being conducted. Because he was outspoken in these things, um, the church excommunicated him. And that I think he, similar to me, was feeling like cognitive dissonance around like these questions and felt like I don't need to ask this. This is stupid. Um, and he started collecting stories of all these people who had either been abused or traumatized through sexually explicit interviews. And I've tried to read some of those stories. He has them up. I don't remember the website off the top of my head, but it's soul crushing.
Yeah, find it and I'll put it in the show notes.
Stories are worth having out there, I think. So in my mind, right, like I think I still love the church, but I, for the life of me, cannot comprehend or understand why this is something that the church is still using. Makes no sense to me, like why they would do this. So that's contributing to what I would call a faith crisis. At this point, I'm starting to experience a crisis of faith where I feel like the church is not showing up in a meaningful way for the most vulnerable in our community, which are our children. Um, so yeah, up to here, um, I'm kind of looking at the world a little bit differently. And I part of me wonders if we had never adopted our children, if I would ever have questioned, maybe I would have, I don't know. But a big part of my faith crisis are all results of consequences and things that followed from these life events changing. It got to a point where I feel like I really feel like I didn't have a choice in all of it. The way I was seeing things at the time, I felt like and feel like there's no other way for all of this to go down. And I mentioned that because I tried really, really hard to make the church work. And I remember like at the time I started noticing things that just didn't make sense. One thing that happened, this was a big thing in Utah years ago. The church, or there was some legislation coming out having to do with legalizing marijuana. And it was for just medical use. It wasn't for recreation. It was just medical use. And there's a whole slew of things that we can see that marijuana is good for people with certain conditions. And in my mind, I'm like, should just be a case closed sort of deal. Keep in mind, at this point in my life, I'd never touched marijuana in my life. I just saw that there was medical benefits and was like, it seems like a good idea. I get a letter from the church saying, like, basically asking its membership to vote in opposition to this legislation. That created some cognitive dissonance for me as well, where I'm like, this makes no sense. Why is the church getting involved uh, in legislative issues this directly?
There's a First Amendment issue in there somewhere.
I just felt like, hey, man, I get it, freedom of religion. I'm in support of that, but I feel like if you're gonna have freedom of religion, then you shouldn't be directly involved with legislation.
Yeah, we call it separation of church and state, right?
And at the time, I think I was more of a Facebook warrior. I was a little bit more unafraid to like share my opinions. And I was very friendly in it. I was very like respectful, but I'm like, I don't think I think that it is inappropriate for the church PR to send this out. And I had a wave of backlash that honestly kind of scared me. I had some people telling me that my late grandpa would have been really disappointed in me, and you're standing on the wrong side of this. And like, just for something that was really simple, it really blew up into something that was a big deal. And that kind of scared me for a second. I'm like, this isn't, am I where I need to be? Is like, this backlash for this opinion is something that you see in like Scientology. It's something that I've seen in some of my cult documentaries, where anybody who speaks out against an organization is a heretic. And I felt like I was being not treated like another brother or sister of Christ, but like a heretic just for talking about this policy that I disagreed with. So that added to it as well. Whenever people ask me, Spencer, why'd you leave the church? In my mind, I don't think it was because of any doctrinal things. The thing that I think took me out above anything else was the amount of anxiety I felt at church. And I think a lot of it had to do with like my kids and being just really sensitive to them, and the amount of pressure I put on myself, and recognizing that it wasn't good for me. At the end of the day, the reason why my wife and I left the church is because it did not make us happy. Um, sure, there was like things that like I've mentioned up to this point that made me uncomfortable, that created some cognitive dissonance. But I went on my mission in the South, right? I had heard a lot of things against Mormons, to be honest, that I thought were just anti-Mormon lies. And then to find out later they were actually true, but that's not where we're at yet. But I was able to deal with cognitive dissonance to some degree. I was good at burying things down. The thing I couldn't bury was how I felt at church every Sunday. I felt like I felt like a constant sense of I'm not good enough. I felt like it was hard. I started slowly feeling like more and more like an outsider. Another thing that didn't make sense to me is like I'm able to get along with people who are outside of the church and relate to them better than with people in the church. And I think a lot of it is because a lot of our relationships in church are masks that we put on in order to get along with others around us. Um,
Yeah, it's this recurring theme in your life, right? There's this side of you that you show at church, and there's the real you. And it seems like to me, maybe that having kids was a little bit of a catalyst for you to wake up to that and maybe realize that the damage that that could cause to someone that hasn't been raised in Mormonism like you were. Am I off base there?
oh, you're spot on, my friend. I think we touched on it before, but I felt like I had to be the guy to keep everyone safe. Like that's a role that life had put on me, that I put on myself, that leadership had put on me. And so this in that role of trying to be a protector, I started being just aware of everything around me. And I started feeling like more uncomfortable around these things that I recognized had traumatized me, being sexual interviews with bishops, and not wanting that for my kids. And so the more I tried to push that down, the more unhappy I was at church, because I I'm growing up in the church, you tend to think of things in black and white ways. And adding gray just threw everything off. It just didn't make sense. So I got to a point where, because I was dealing with so much cognitive dissonance and the church was really making me unhappy, I decided, like, all right, that's it. I need to know if the church is true. I had heard whisperings of a document called A Letter to My Wife. Um, and I had heard about articles that FAIR was doing to answer like difficult questions. And I knew at the time that there was difficult stuff with Mormon history. It wasn't really as much of a priority to me, because for me, It was the real life consequences of your kids dealing with leadership that could be asking in like that was way bigger on my brain. But I'm like, if I could at least know if the church is true, that would make things so much easier. And so I started reading Letter to My Wife because, to be honest, at the time, the CES letter scared me. I had heard from some people that like he's very harsh in his tone, and that you might be better off reading Letter to My Wife. And I'm like, I'm going to go through all of these, and I'm going to counter everything in here, because I need this church to be true. So I did that. I went through, I read all of it, and I'm reading things that I thought were anti-Mormon lies that I remember specifically telling people on my mission that is an anti-Mormon lie that is made up by enemies of the church. And then to see in this document source things from the church website was mind-blowing. Um, I remember feeling a distinct feeling of like I had been lied to, like I had been deceived. It created a lot of anger because now I'm having to wrestle with this idea. I gave up 2 years of my life for this church, sacrificed for my family when I could have been there for my family. And it just felt really, really heavy. Um,
So what made you finally decide that, you know what, I just can't be a part of this anymore?
we tried to do the nuance thing where you're like, okay, there's all these legitimate things that you could try to explain away, and but there's a lot writing. I don't think a lot of people outside of the church really understand the amount of social pressure, especially in Utah. There are certain avenues career-wise that could be closed up to you if you leave the church. You could lose the respect of family members. And keep in mind, my psychology is such where I don't feel good enough. I need validation from others around me telling me I'm doing the right thing. And letting that go felt almost impossible. So we tried to do the nuance thing, the physically in, mentally out. Let's just go through the motions and try to appreciate church where we can. But it was causing an incredible amount of stress. Like every Sunday, it felt horrible. I had a calling at the time. I had two callings. I was teaching the youth in our ward, and for the third hour, I was teaching an elders quorum. And as I'm trying to prep for these lessons, I'm finding that I'm teaching just more loosey goosey, like keeping it as secular as I possibly can. But in Elders Quorum, it was so specific about Joseph Smith, and I'm reading through the lesson plan, and I'm like, I could pick out exactly every point of this where it is misleading. And it felt dirty to me. And it was just it made me so unhappy. Um, and it felt like I was living a lie. And I felt like I was being unauthentic, not only to all my loved ones around me, but to myself. And I'm like, I thought to myself, I'm basically putting on a mask so people will accept me. And no matter how hard I try to believe again, nothing's working. Um, so I'd say like the reason why I left, or the catalyst thing that made me want to leave, was recognizing that the church did not make us happy and was causing more stress in our lives than it was a blessing. And so we opted to step away. Um,
So first, did you tell your family about this? Were you public about it? And two, if you did, what was their reaction to it?
this is fun. So I didn't do the whole Facebook announcement. I'd seen examples of people do that, and more often than not, it's just 90% of Facebook does not care what you do in or out of the church. Sorry, that's just the way it goes. So I opted to tell the people that I cared about most in my life. And I remember being terrified with this because I think the thing that makes it uncomfortable as an ex-Mormon is we've been on the other side of the table where someone has told us that they don't believe, and we have all the answers, right? And so I'm imagining like telling my friends and family, and I know all their responses before they say them. Um, but And I also know what believing membership think of people who leave the church. And this is something I want to get out, that no matter how well you explain yourself to someone who believes, like no matter what, you are going to drop at least a tier in their mind as far as like how much they respect you. Like no matter what, the faster you can get to accepting that, the easier it's going to be. And I think everybody goes through this where it's like, if I tell them the right way, they'll still respect me. And that just isn't going to happen. Um, I think I had one person who I would say is gave a textbook healthy response to me telling them that I left the church. Everyone else, I think, was I got the sense that they were disappointed in me. I felt like I was judged. My mom took it really hard, like basically felt like I was throwing everything away. I had a sibling that felt the same way. Um, the conversations were hard. Um, and again, being someone who cares about validation and like, guys, I'm doing the best I can, not being able to get that, it hurt. It hurt a great deal.
So you tell people, you maybe don't get the reaction that you were hoping for, obviously. What was the emotional impact of all of this? So first, not being in an organization that was deeply meaningful to you and that you were raised in, and then also not getting the validation from the people that you most care about when you decide to step away.
Yeah. It's isolating. That is the emotional result. It's extremely isolating. I felt incredibly lonely. Um, I felt like I had gone down a tier in everyone's book. I felt like I was less worthwhile. I was scared about how this would affect the kids. Um, it was hard. Yeah, isolating is how I would probably describe that.
Did you move from deconstructing Mormonism immediately into deconstructing God, or did that take a little bit more time?
I don't think I deconstructed God for at least probably 3 years after that. Um, a lot of it was continuing to deconstruct Mormonism. Um, I think I had a phase after I left because I felt isolated. I felt alone. Um, I stayed in what I would call like an anger loop. I was spending a lot of time on the ex-Mormon subreddit, which was good at first because I think it's good to have a landing point where you can just have an unfiltered blow off steam in a way that, believing family and members wouldn't have patience for. I I spent a lot of time on Mormon subreddit. Um, and I kept on like finding more things. Like I swear to you, even to this day, being out for, 5 years at this point, I still find things where I'm like, I had no idea about that. Wow. There is so much that the church went out of its way to, in my mind, cover up. I know you can probably go back and forth on that, but in my mind, I didn't learn about these things, and I was told what to tell investigators on my mission, and I had, without my knowledge, lied to many people. Um, I guess it's not an overt lie, but yeah,
What is this anger loop like, and how does it manifest itself?
it's how would I describe it? I think some of it's with ADHD, you get into hyperfixations. And at that time, Mormonism was the biggest thing on my mind. And no matter how hard I tried, it was just constantly living in my brain rent free. And I think a lot of it is because I'm trying to um, navigate through something difficult. And I didn't really have an outlet, that I could do. Like, I didn't want to, like, one thing that was important to me at the time was not burning every single bridge I have. I know some people in our community are like, burn it all down, like all of them. If they're on that side, then screw them. And I didn't want that because I had, I have legitimately good friendships that I wasn't willing to let go of because of my anger with the church. One of my friends had like to the, had like such a good response. Instead of trying to come up with every counterpoint he could to the things I was saying and my reasons and my lived experience, he just listened. It's like, okay, that sounds really difficult. Thank you for telling me about that. And it just was like so perfect. And that's one thing I wish there was better messaging around in the church, is like how to deal with people who no longer believe. Um, he did such a good job, but it was just really lonely for a while.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the problem with wanting the church to teach people to handle their loved ones leaving the church better is that it probably would lead to those people leaving the church as well. So I don't know if any of your family and friends have also left as a result of this.
I don't think they want it to be easy for people to leave. And I think that's by design. I think the harder you can make it for someone to leave, the more likely it is for them to stay. So even though, like with Jehovah's Witnesses, it's in their doctrine to shun. And in the LDS world, we do not shun, but there's more subversive ways they get people to come to that conclusion. It's in their teachings. They teach in a very black and white way. You're either on the side of God or you're not. You can't serve God and mammon. And so it creates a very black and white mindset, at least in my mind.
So it sounds like this anger loop and this feeling of isolation that goes on for maybe 3 or 4 years, right?
Yeah. And eventually what it turned into was I think a big problem is I kept a lot of it internal. Or to my poor wife, who's like, dude, get over it. She was able to move on a lot easier than I could. And sometimes she'd be like, oh, dude, you're spending a lot of time in these spaces. You need to like find something else. Um, and then yeah, it's eventually at some point I deconstruct God and existence, and that's a whole other element. But one thing I want to talk about before we jump into existentialism, because that's where more or less it kind of landed for me, there was um I felt really hungry for community, and I felt like I didn't have community at the time. A lot of my friends were off to grad school, or had really young children. And so that close, tight group of friends that I had as a support system to me all my life, all of a sudden I felt othered to some degree. And if you were to ask them, like, do you feel like you were othering Spencer? They'd be like, no. And I don't think they did. I think if I went to any of them, they would still be great friends. But I think this is just more how I felt, because I'm not in your tribe anymore. I feel like there's not, I feel like maybe you won't be able to accept me anymore. And it kind of, my defenses were up. So at the time, I was really hungry for community and didn't know where to look. Um, I had got into riding motorcycles. Um, I am a huge lover of motorcycles, and a big reason for that is I would consider myself to be more of an anxious type of brain. I'm always thinking about things that are good, that could happen. And one thing I love about motorcycles is no matter how anxious you are, when you get on a motorcycle, it literally forces everything to be present. You can smell the road, you can feel the vibrations of the motor, you can feel the air. There's just all these things that make you present. And so I found myself getting really attached to riding motorcycles for therapeutic reasons. And eventually, something I did that I think really helped me and kind of got me out of this anger loop and isolation loop was finding community within the motorcycle community. And I eventually made really good friends and went on tons of crazy adventures, traveling the country on a motorcycle, and really found value in that.
Yeah, I really like this idea of finding hobbies, things that you really like doing just for the sake of doing them, and then building community around those things. I think people that leave high demand religions tend to try to replace the high demand religion with a like for like experience. So, I'm going to leave Mormonism. Now I'm going to go be a Unitarian Universalist, right? Or a humanist, and I'm going to go to a congregation. And that's fine. That works for some people. But I don't necessarily think that you have to do that. So you mentioned here, you really like your motorcycle group. What do you think is important about having a hobby that I'm going to use air quotes here doesn't matter, right? Before we get into existentialism, right? But having a hobby that doesn't necessarily have an end goal or an end purpose in mind, it's just something that you enjoy doing for the sake of doing.
Element is one of the keys to happiness. Being able to do something, not because there's some grand reason for doing it, but just for the sake of doing it. Because it makes you happy. It could be as simple as that. I think honestly, that is where happiness it is. It isn't grind set hustle. It isn't making tons of money. It isn't starting a cult or another religion or going with something dogmatic, or it isn't some belief system. It's learning how to find beauty in simple things. At least it was for me. Um, I think I I think growing up in the church, everything has to mean something. Everything has to be tied to something bigger. Um, like extra hobbies are sometimes looked down on, like, oh, you need to be spending time making money for your family or doing this or that. But I think finding autonomy in simple things is huge. Like for instance, like with a little kid that's building sandcastles. Do you think he's building sandcastles because there's some greater meaning to it, or because it's going to make some sort of God happy with him? No, he's doing it just because it's fun, because it is bringing joy. So, another huge part that I would say with being post out of the church is finding beauty in everything around me. Like I mentioned, motorcycles was one part. I really love like art and particularly movies. I look at movies completely differently than I did before. Um, Going through, I love learning about different philosophy and ideas and just being able to not put any sort of dogma on it. Just look at it for what it is and be like, did that give me any sort of value in any way, shape, or form? If so, how? What does this mean for me? And then move forward. And yeah, I'd say that presentism um, and finding joy in everything has really helped bring value in my life.
What is it specifically about film that really speaks to you?
I'd say it's a mirror of the whole human experience. There are aspects of film that I find immense beauty in, like a trope you hear about a lot is the hero's journey. The someone coming from nothing and building and overcoming, and then eventually, there's some point where they fall again, and then they overcome, and then they achieve their goal. That's inspiring to me. Um, Learning about, I don't know, I was just watching something recently, like you see family dynamics in movies. Um, you learn about loss in movies. It just paints different parts of life in a way that is digestible and accessible. And I find so much beauty in the human experience.
What else would you say that you've learned about yourself during this experience of leaving Mormonism, and building meaning and purpose kind of in a post-religious sense?
Um, there's something I've learned. It is, I have a lot of things I've learned. Holy cow. It is that just because something changes doesn't mean that it is the end of the world. And that's a message I'd want to pass on to my kids as well is that life is going to throw you curveballs that you thought would never happen. If you can breathe through it and press forward, there's going to be a tomorrow, even though it seems like the world might be collapsing on you. Um, and that life and finding worth is not determined by other people. You can determine your own worth. And that will carry you further than anything an outside organization or group can ever do. And it doesn't need to come from God either. That was another thing that kind of messed me up a little was I I needed, and the only way we have worth is because of Jesus dying for us. And that in order for us to be good enough, we had to have someone die violently for us. It kind of took me away from actually dealing with things on my own and said you could just put it over here on Jesus. That could be something that works really well for some people, but for me, it was insufficient as being able to work through my issues.
Is leaving that thought process behind just as painful and just as, I guess, violent to your psyche as leaving Mormonism was? Or now that you had that tool set, did it make it a little bit easier?
So yeah, I don't remember what the quote is, but they say like if you can deconstruct Mormonism, you have a whole a whole set of tools that you can use to deconstruct everything. So yeah, it was easy to deconstruct that. It didn't mean it wasn't traumatizing. Like all this stuff that you can, the same logic of leaning on truth claims rather than trust me, bro, or dogmas. You can use for religion, you can use it in politics, you can use it on everything. You can use it on reality itself, and that is a that is a slippery slope. So yeah, I did that for a while, and I think so it was one thing to lose Mormonism. It was another thing to lose my total trust and faith in Jesus. Because eventually the conclusion I came down to was there's no way to know for sure if Jesus is a deity, if he died for my sins. Um, there's no way to prove that. And also putting in context the thousands of other religions that exist in the world that have truth claims as well. Um, one thing I used to hold on to for so long was the gift of the Holy Ghost and that feeling you get when you're reading something or you hear something spiritual and you feel that warmness in your chest and you're like, oh, that means it's true. One thing that threw that completely out the door, and this is, in my opinion, like the ultimate counter, is a YouTube video called Spiritual Witnesses. Because commonly, like where I see a lot of conversations that go into truth claims, it's like, well, it doesn't matter, what the truth claims say or what the history says. I know that God told me that this is real. Well, there's a whole video of people from a myriad of high demand religions and cults bearing their testimony, not too far unlike we in Mormonism bear our testimonies, talking about how they have this warm feeling, therefore they know that their belief system is true. That confused the crap out of me. It basically threw out like that being a legitimate source for truth, you know?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I recently heard a story of someone who was watching a video about the creation of the national anthem by Francis Scott Key. And this person was having like a really emotional spiritual experience while watching this video. And then he came to find out that 90% plus of the video was completely fabricated. And so he was having this really powerful spiritual experience about something that was almost entirely false. And just to your point, it really shows that your feelings can't be trusted as facts in any way.
Yeah. And that was a hard thing to deal with. Now, here's the thing with that. It doesn't mean that these good feelings don't have any value. I actively search for that feeling every day. That feeling of awe, I suppose, is what you could call it. That feeling of connection to the world around you. Um, I still love those feelings. There's just one major difference, and that is I do not attach truth claims to that. Just because I have this feeling about this thing does not make that thing true. And I think that the LDS Church has co opted those feelings to be one and the same with truth. They have programmed people to think that this is what truth is. Um, and it's insufficient for truth claims because that's how many dangerous things have been started is by people having these powerful emotional experiences. I love those still, but they just don't hold truth in my mind anymore.
Yeah, so well put. Thank you for sharing that. So if you can't rely on these feelings as any sort of barometer for truth, how do you kind of then redefine purpose and meaning, and how do you search for that in your life now?
Um, so this is a scary thing with like deconstructing as you realize every religion, every belief system, everything that has ever been made is man-made. It is a reflection of our human experience and humanity just doing its best to answer some of the most difficult questions in life. Where are we going after we die? Is there any purpose? What is reality? Like these are hard questions. Um, and so recognizing that religion is literally just people doing the best they can to come up with answers to these things. My answer to your question is that I think finding happiness has to be determined on our own, is where I more or less have landed. Finding value in life is something that I think every individual has to figure out. I think when you're in a religion, you have a very regimented, enclosed structure, or I guess encapsulating path that tells you everything you need to be happy. And for some people, that works fantastic. They don't have to think about anything deeper. I got all my morals right here, and they work amazing. I'm just going to stick to that, and we're good. When you're not in that, you don't have that, you have to kind of figure that out on your own. And for me, it was a matter of sitting down and figuring out what I valued most of all. And then creating that as my anchor. A lot of my belief in what makes the world a good place is based on ethics. Um, and I think there are parts of many religions that you can pull from a philosophical point of view and pull them into everyday life, and they can be used to great effect and good. For instance, like a code that I still hold to that's still very Christian, but I think works amazing is the golden rule. Um, in everything that you do to others, or what is it like, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, I think is a really good deal. So, and I think there's a version of the golden rule found in other things as well, but that is kind of what I lean to. Um, that idea of just picking from things that I think are the best ideas. And you could find good ideas in different trains of philosophical school. You could find good ideas from different religions. The one thing I try to avoid, though, is having a one size fits all or a one rule answers everything. I say whatever makes me the happiest spiritually is what I'm going to gather tools from. And when I say makes me the happiest, I don't mean like physically fulfilled. I mean like when I'm helping others or I'm a service to others, that makes me feel good. So therefore, I will continue to do those things because it gives a sense of reward and connection to people around me.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest criticisms to all of this that some people might say is, well, if everyone's their own arbiter of moral truth, then that could lead to societal breakdown pretty easily, and it's not hard to imagine that, right? But like you just articulated, pulling your ethics from traditional sources of wisdom like religion. So, the golden rule, like you mentioned, and there are others, can be a way to kind of combat that. I'm curious, if you do that with any other aspect of Mormonism. Do you pull any sort of wisdom from what you learn from Mormonism into your current life?
The golden rule was one, I guess, from just general Christianity. The Mormonism's focus on the family is beautiful, full stop. I think having a focus on family is really good for helping a family kind of make it through life. I think that there's a lot of other issues that kind of make Mormonism difficult, particularly like we mentioned with interviews that shouldn't happen, the shame that's involved in the church. But putting family as a focus, I think, is a beautiful thing that I have chosen to take into my life now. A lot of my happiness in life revolves around having a beautiful family. I believe in being loyal to your spouse, and being honest, and being honorable. What does it mean to be honorable? It means you do the right thing even when no one else is looking. Like, these are things that I was raised with, that I will take and I have taught to my children, and I hope they teach to their children. Um, I don't believe in throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. I think you could find good parts of every religion. What I don't have time for, though, are the unnecessary dogmas. I don't need all of the religion to be true for me to get value from it, nor do I need to have my records on it for me to have value.
So, how do you navigate all of this with believing family and friends?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think, like, one thing that ex-Mormons are really good at doing is deconstructing Mormon truth claims. We're great at that. We're not always really good at washing all the Mormon off us. And what I mean by that is black and white thinking. It's easy, and it's a very easy trap to fall into for a lot of ex-Mormons, and I'm guilty of this to some degree myself, in putting believing members in a camp of they're stupid, or they don't know anything, or I'm better than them, or they're supporting a corrupt organization, so therefore they are not good, and I need to avoid them or disparage them at every chance I get. I am so glad I avoided that temptation, because I can tell you, if I was like that with them, I wouldn't have any of those friends to this day. Um, I think you, I think a lot of believing members have ideas in their mind about what an ex-Mormon is. And I would have just been validating all of that if I just wrote all of them off or was judgmental. Um, I think it is difficult, but what I've done is I've kind of tried, like, again, going back to the golden rule, treat others how you would like them to treat you. I want to have, I want my friends and family to have grace with me and respect me for my spiritual decisions. So, in that same right, I need to respect my friends and family for their spiritual decisions. So, a lot of how I've navigated things in this ex Mormon life is just learning how to give them space for their spiritual journey, in hopes that they will give me space. And that's something you kind of have to play. Like, you have to kind of go on a touch and go basis, because some people who are believers could overstep boundaries, and you have to do boundary readjustment and things like that. But just being able to create space for them has opened up space for me. And I have had wonderful conversations with believing friends and family. Um, and that's one thing I'm actually really proud of, is even though I'm an ex-Mormon, I am very critical of the LDS Church. I have maintained excellent friendships, and things have gotten much easier over the years with a lot of my believing friends and family.
Yeah, that's really well put. Thank you. So landing the plane here a little bit. What gets you excited for the future, Spencer? What are you working on? Yeah, what gets you excited?
Just thinking about how much I didn't know at age 20, and how much I didn't know and then learned at age 30. And then I'm 37. How much more am I going to know at 40? I look forward to learning more about the world and more about myself. That makes me excited. I'm very excited to see how my kids do in their lives. And I'm excited to see them kind of navigate this world. Um, I'm just excited for the moment to moment things that are coming my way because I had no idea what was coming 10 years ago and 10 years ago before that. So I just want to maintain a sense of curiosity and never completely close myself off to anything and always try to pull whatever good I can from wherever I go.
Spencer, you're a really good example of an ex-Mormon, an ex-high demand religious person, right? That has been able to maintain those family relationships and those friend relationships and find meaning and purpose in their life. So, really appreciate you sharing that with us. And you're going to be a grandpa soon.
That's right. My oldest, super proud of him. Him and his partner are having a little girl who's due in February. And that is an absolute trip. we're uh, we're on the younger side for you wouldn't think you I know I look old, but I'm only 37. You wouldn't think grandpa.
When you adopt a 10-year-old when you're 25, that's what happens. But yeah, it sounds like you're super proud of him.
Just he is super responsible. He's made excellent career decisions and is showing all the signs of stability and courage that I wish I had when I was his age. Honestly, like I felt so lost at the same time, like when I was his age. I think he's going to make an excellent father, and I'm looking forward to playing a supporting role in that in whatever way I can.
I really appreciate your time today, Spencer. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I think this is the first time I've ever tried to tell my story in one sitting. I think I've gone through like I've told different parts of the story at different times, but this is the first time I've attempted to bring a cohesion to all of it. There's a lot of moving parts, and I just want to say I appreciate you taking the time to let me jump on your platform and tell my story. It means a lot.
Yeah, well, you did a great job, and the narrative of your life came through really clearly, and I think it'll be really impactful for people. So thank you for being willing to share it.
My pleasure. Good luck with your continued venture. I hope you do really well with this. I think, yeah, like we said earlier, you can't ever have too many stories out there of people telling their truth, and I think you'll do great work here.
Thanks, Spencer. We'll talk to you later. Bye.